France's unpopular leader, after 100 days in office with near record-low approval ratings, is the president's honeymoon over? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Emmanuel Macron. Well, for a man who once compared himself to the Roman god Jupiter, Emmanuel Macron has had an astronomical fall back to earth. He's seen the fastest drop in approval ratings for any French president in more than 20 years. The latest surveys suggest more than half of French voters think Macron hasn't kept his promises, and more than 1/3 think things have only changed for the worst. So just 3 months into his presidency, how has it all gone so wrong for Macron? And can he turn it around, or is his vision of a new France already vanishing? Natalie Pohonen takes a look.
On France's National Day, the country put on a show of energy and electronica, with a leader who gets the pop culture references and is up for a game of who can hold a handshake the longest. It was a display of Gallic public relations for all the world to see. But when it comes to domestic popularity, President Emmanuel Macron hasn't been so lucky with his performance. He's only been in office for 100 days, but his personal approval rating stands at only 36%. That's even lower than it was for his deeply unpopular predecessor, François Hollande. Macron swept into office with En Marche, the new party he founded just over a year ago, promising change and political renewal. He secured 65% of the vote and defeated the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen.
Je vous servirai au nom de notre devise: liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Macron has vowed to walk a centrist path instead of veering to the left or the right like previous presidents. His mission includes an ambitious plan to reform the economy through tax cuts, a major shake-up of labour laws, and cutting up to 120,000 public sector jobs over the next 5 years.
Jusqu'ici, trop souvent, nous avons fait fausse route. Nous avons préféré les procédures aux résultats, le règlement à l'initiative, la société de la rente à la société de la justice. Et je crois profondément que par ces choix récents, notre peuple nous demande d'emprunter une voie radicalement nouvelle.
But slashing spending has already led to a backlash against his leadership. The military chief, General Pierre de Villiers, resigned in protest over defence budget cuts. And the president has also come under fire for plans to create an American-style office for the First Lady, Brigitte Macron. More than 300,000 people have signed a petition against the move. But his biggest test is on the horizon, after the summer holidays. That's when Macron is expected to pass a decree to change the labour code to radically alter the workplace, including making it easier for bosses to hire and fire staff. French unions and citizens are renowned for their ability to protest and strike, and previous attempts to change working conditions have failed. Macron has shown he's not afraid of criticism, but will he be able to stay the course if it means becoming an even more unpopular president? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to talk more about Macron's standing and what's to come going forward, I'm joined from l'Île-de-France by Anne Le Breton. She is the deputy mayor of Paris's 4th district. From the capital, Paris, Alyssa Rubin. She's the Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. And from Washington, D.C., Jeff Lightfoot. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks all so much for joining us. Alyssa, let me start with you. Given the French public's often very fickle support for their politicians, especially over the last 15 years, did Macron ever really stand a chance?
Well, I would say we won't know. Actually, I would say he still stands a chance.
Even given the lowest popularity ratings?
I mean, at the moment, yes, I actually really do believe that if he can deliver on the economy, that's an enormous benefit for France. No one has managed to do that in the past. You know, neither Mr. Sarkozy, who was on the right, nor Mr. Hollande on the left. Jacques Chirac himself retreated from some of the reforms. So I actually think that if there is a real change and there are more jobs especially for young people, that will make a great difference. But balanced against that, I think we have to remember that in the primaries, or not primaries, but the first round of the general election, Macron got about 24% of the vote. That's not a huge, that's 1 in 4 people who voted. And Marine Le Pen didn't do so much worse. So it was a very divided field. And I think the French are very divided about what they want.
Okay, Jeff, let me ask you, do you think Macron can turn his fortunes around?
I think he has an uphill climb,
Yes,
and one of the reasons I think that is because
Hold on, Alyssa, I'm letting Jeff grab this one.
Sorry.
Well, I actually agree with Anna. I think he can, but I do think it's an uphill climb, in part because he doesn't have that party base. I mean, his political party, La République En Marche, is a new movement. So he's outside of the traditional party structures, and I think that's allowed his popularity to fall a little bit. And as Anne mentioned, he is quite divided. These labor reforms will be a good thing for France if he can get them through, but they certainly won't be popular. And so he may be a politician who does the right thing, but finds himself with a rather low popularity rating. But what works in his favor, I think, is that the political opposition is decimated. So Macron's popularity numbers aren't very good, but it's not as if the opposition necessarily has very strong numbers either. So there really isn't much of an alternative to Macron right now for France. And I think because of that, he still has a chance to turn his fortunes around.
Okay, Anne, I imagine you're at least on the same page there. You do believe in him. He gave hope over the course of his campaign. You still think that hope is alive? How do you expect him to tangibly change things in France for the better?
Well, I agree very much that there's a misunderstanding about the polls, because in France now, we're not in a situation where there are 2 parties. We're really in a situation where there are 4 blocs. And we won, you know, in the first round by 25%. So it's not especially surprising that we're around that, our polls are the way they are now. What's going to count is what we're able to achieve in September. People are really expecting change. And so it's going to be all about what we can do. And we were elected on a very much of a reformist program. And if we can deliver on reform, I think that naturally the polls will turn around. We shouldn't worry too much about that for the moment.
Alyssa, then let me ask you, all 3 of you have expressed some hope going forward. Then what up until now was his biggest mistake? What do you think really drove those poll ratings down?
Well, I think what we felt watching him, and I'm speaking when I say we, I'm just thinking here journalistically, sort of from an attempt to be as nonpartisan as possible. He often spoke in really very abstract terms, and he wasn't very concrete about what exactly he was going to do, for instance, in the labor law. So everyone, my sense is, imagines their worst nightmare scenario rather than what might actually be the result of all the deal making that's going on right now. And, you know, Macron is not completely tone deaf, and he recognizes that if you do something so that hurts too many people, it will reverberate throughout the society, even if, in fact, you might end up with some real gains as a result. So I do do have some hope that he will be sensitive to that. And my reason for that is that we've seen at least some of the labor unions make, if not conciliatory noises, not outright opposition. The strongest certainly have been threatened strikes. I think the first is either on the 9th or the 12th of September. But I still think that it will really depend if it's all of labor and if it's all of young people. But and so I think he did himself a bit of a disservice by not being as specific as he could have been.
But Alyssa, what about the much publicized falling out with the military, as well as his position on making his wife a formal French First Lady, creating that office, even after he criticized nepotism in French politics?
Right. I think he has a lot to learn about being a leader and of seeing how an ordinary person will look at what he's doing. Both of those were real missteps, and that's why I say he can be, you know, he's not completely tone deaf, but he is a bit tone deaf, and that's why, you know, I wrote about both of those incidents because they were striking. And in general, the military has very wide support in France. It's seen as nonpartisan, as serving the Republic before it serves any individual party or leader. And I'm not sure really why that was necessary. I think it could have been handled in many other ways. As for the situation with his wife, I think again, he really suffered from not being clear. If you read the petition that did so well on the internet, it sort of made a reference to her to the spouse being paid, and that was not part of Macron's proposal to begin with. That was what he wanted was to somehow give her some sort of title that reflected, or some sort of position that would really explain what she did.
Okay.
Because otherwise she'll just go ahead and do it anyway,
right.
But without that.
And what do you think? Were those missteps that perhaps he regrets, or do you think he was right on in making those calls? Maybe they were tougher calls for him to make, but he did the right thing by the military and by trying to create a First Lady for France?
I think the question of the First Lady for France was really not something very important for him or for the French. And it's the paradox is that whenever she's on the papers, they sell like, you know, so she's very popular in a way. But it's true, French people have always had a distrust of putting families, you know, they like seeing them, but they don't want them officially, you know, in the picture. So that was, and it was not something very important at all in the program, and so that's just going to be blown over in a few minutes. What happened with the military is very different, and I personally have met people from the military who thought there was, you know, a lot more good than you can think in that crisis, that what had been coming from a long way back, it's not just something that happened in 2 days, you know, in a clash between two people. So they maybe, you know, some people within the military think maybe there was a good idea to, you know, show who does what. And it is important that the president can, you know, has his way. He's the head of the army. And so, you know, I don't know if it was so much of a crisis that could have been avoided, and things are going to stand in a much clearer way from now on.
Okay, Jeff, I saw you nodding your head in agreement at one point there.
Yeah, if I may, what I think is important about the dispute that he had with the military was in part because it pits two of his big strategic priorities and two of France's strategic priorities against each other. One is that the country has to reduce its expenses to get below the EU mandated 3% of GDP for the annual deficit. That's the number one thing that and labor reform are really the top things that Macron was trying to achieve while the country is at war. And it's pretty clear that the military needs about, as I understand it, about 2 billion euros a year in extra expenses to really replenish equipment that's been degraded in operations in Africa, to increase training because a lot of troops are out in Paris and in other French cities to protect important sites. And so this is a country that's at war, a military that's under great duress and feels it's at a breaking point. And so Macron had to make a choice. And he had to choose the economy, even though he promised later to increase the defense expenditure. So I think that was an important moment because it showed that austerity is going to rule the day, I think, under this administration, because there really isn't much of a choice for Macron at this point.
Austerity, yeah, could be key, and that is very unlikely to gain him more points in the polls, unfortunately. Jeff, let me ask you then, does he need popular support now to go forward with changing labor laws and enacting tax reform, or should he just barrel forward and do this regardless of how unpopular it may be?
Well, structurally, he has a substantial majority in the parliament of the La République En Marche, and really the question is, will they stay aligned with him? These are in many cases, new politicians who don't have a lot of experience and are still learning how to even govern in the National Assembly. So structurally, he's got the support that he needs to enact the legislation. He's got the ordinances are set so he can do the labor reform law by decree. But the question is, if a lot of people in France feel like they didn't have an option, a credible option last May in the voting because it was a choice between the center and the far right, will they express themselves in the streets? And sometimes that's more powerful than the National Assembly. But I think he has to proceed. I think he knows, is very clear about what the challenges are facing France. I don't think you could say that about his predecessor. And so I expect Macron, I think he's a little stubborn, and I expect him to proceed and take some difficult choices because I think he knows that this is a now or never moment for France.
Alyssa, I see you slightly nodding at agreement there. Do you think he will be able to push through these most difficult labor and tax reforms?
Well, I agree with Jeff that, he's basically helped the current majority in the parliament get there. They ran on his, as members of his party or members of a closely allied party, the moderate, Mouvement Démocratique. And so they in a sense owe him something, and they've already voted for the ordonnance. It's not like the American or system where there'll be a chance for amendment. He will present it, and people will, and it will go into effect, as Jeff said, by decree. I do think the difficulty is how much people take to the streets, in how many cities that happens, and whether it requires violent action by the police to stop them and to get the country back to work. And I do, that has been what has defeated some of these efforts in the past, and I don't know how much stomach Macron will have for confronting people if there is that kind of outpouring. I think this will be the real test. Do the French want change? Do they want the risks that always come with economic change? Or do they really not want to take those risks right now? And I'm waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, and how are you feeling about that going forward? The French public's response might be tough. They might take to the streets. There might be clashes with police. Is Macron ready for that when he tries to build these labor reforms and change tax law?
Well, I'm not, we'll have to wait until September, but I'm not even sure the French are ready to take to the streets, because the only part of France's opposition that is ready to do that is the extreme left, which is a quarter. When I said we were 4 quarters in the first round of the presidential election, it's only 1/4 of those French people who are ready to do that. I don't think they're quite organized enough. I'm not sure it's even going to happen. And of course, nobody likes to go for reform with everybody in the street. So that's going to be the big test of September. And the extreme left knows it, and they're getting ready for it. But so are we. We were elected very much with a reform program. We have a large majority in the parliament, and the people voted for us in the parliament. They had a choice. it wasn't only voting against Marine Le Pen. For the parliamentary elections, people really gave us a clear mandate. So of course we can, we can push in all those reforms, and of course nobody likes to push in reforms against the street. But will we be able to convince the street, to go with us for the reform? People know deep down inside them in France that we need to change a lot of things. And I think that even though we are low in the polls, the idea of reform is something that French people have started to be convinced about.
Okay, Anne, I'm going to leave it there with you, and I think that's an interesting thought to leave on, because I really haven't heard that before. We're so accustomed to seeing the French really combat reform, especially in their economy. There usually are people taking to the streets whenever the government attempts to enact this kind of labor law change and tax reform. So I hope you're right. I hope France can remain stable and see its way through it. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Take care. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Duterte's diplomatic dance. How is Manila's shift away from the U.S. toward China impacting the region? And taking the Assad regime to court. We speak with an investigator attempting to bring justice to victims of Syrian war crimes. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. All this week, we're bringing you special reports from the Philippines. Today, we turn our attention to how President Rodrigo Duterte is positioning his country on the world stage. He's almost as unpopular overseas as he is popular at home with his crass, no-holds-barred style. But one issue overshadowing his controversial rhetoric is his shifting stance toward China and away from the U.S. That's upset some Filipinos and regional neighbors who say he should be pressuring China over the disputed South China Sea. Randolph Nogel spent time with a community at the heart of the rift and sent this report.
The catch is in. And for these fishermen, it's better than it has been in years. Not long ago, they were blockaded by China's naval forces, prevented from accessing a traditional Philippine fishing ground rich in resources, known to them as the Scarborough Shoal.
It's difficult to be fishing nearby the shore. We need to go further into the Scarborough Shoal to be able to have enough for our family and needs.
Carding is preparing for another trip. He says life was harder for people in this community before China lifted some territorial restrictions late last year.
Suddenly, what was ours was no longer ours. But now, everything is okay. At first, it was hard, but we're hoping things continue as they are.
The Scarborough Shoal has been a source of abundance for this fishing community for generations. And even though they currently have access, there are still concerns over China's ambitions for expansion, something which could mean further limitations and even danger for fishermen like Carding. The shoal is a small ring of reefs that lies just 230 kilometers from the Philippines and 650 kilometers from the nearest Chinese landmass of Hainan. It is just one of the disputed territories in the South China Sea. China's so-called 9-dash line marks the extent of its claim, to the dismay of Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. It's why many critics of Beijing's reach say smaller states with a claim need to present a united front.
And I'm very happy that they are sincere and they are really they're there to comply with their commitments to us.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has shied away from applying pressure on China over the issue. It's a policy reversal from the previous government, which had pursued a ruling against China by an international arbitration tribunal.
A lot of senior officials within the government were saying that You know, the Philippines secured a landmark arbitration case against China that nullified almost the entirety of China's claims across the South China Sea. That could have served as a precursor for additional arbitration cases against China. So with Duterte saying that he said, I'm gonna set it aside, he has essentially killed the momentum.
In what was seen as an effort to quiet his critics, Duterte has said Beijing warned him of a potential war if he pressed a hard line on the disputed territories.
I think what Duterte is trying to do is just to focus more on domestic security concerns, on his war on drugs. So he's just saying we cannot have two fights at the same time on two fronts.
For us, the president's tactics were effective in terms of coming to an agreement with the Chinese. But of course, what we really want in the long run is that they no longer are present in this area. Because while they are still there, we are living in fear.
But for those who depend on these once troubled waters, they hope they can stay calm. And that at the end of the day, they can simply bring home their catch. Randolph Noble, the Newsmakers in Quito on the Philippines' west coast.
Well, for more, I'm joined from Manila by Senator Richard Gordon. He is the chairman of the Philippines Red Cross. And from Washington, D.C., we have Abigail Ballard. She's an Asia analyst for the Center for American Progress. Thanks both so much for joining us. Senator Gordon, let me start with you. You said before that Duterte's foreign policy, read the United States and China, is very short-sighted. Why?
I don't think I said it in that context. I always believe that our foreign policy should always have the long view of making sure that we adhere to an independent foreign policy and that no country should dictate to us, and that we should always defend our national territory, our national sovereignty, and our national interests, as well as our right to self-determination. Now, in the case of China, China is a big neighbor to us, and we must learn to handle it in a way that we preserve our integrity, our national territory, and make sure that they know that we're going to stand by our basic national interests. From the standpoint of the Philippines with the United States, we've had a long relationship with America, but so far the relationship in history has been one of primus inter pares, with the Americans getting the first and the Filipinos getting the equals. In other words, it has never been a consistent policy where the treatment of the Philippines by America has been different in the way it treated its other allies that it fought with, that we fought with the United States, for the United States, and for freedom against the Japanese, for example, and even in the case of Korea. So we have to really balance out our foreign policy in that sense.
Okay, Senator, but let me just get clear here. Earlier, when you'd said that the policy is short-sighted, you said that Duterte's government was actually looking toward China to help solve domestic problems at the cost of causing potentially bigger problems later, particularly in the Philippines' relationship with the United States.
Well, it's short-sighted in the sense that we may be getting some aid from China or some good loans from China that are liberal. But in the long run, we have to watch out that the aid or the support that China is giving us, we must realize that they're not giving it without being transactional. They're hoping that we are going to keep quiet on our claims insofar as the Spratt lease is concerned. But we do know that we have a neighbor, and although they have good intentions, we know what they're capable of. And in that sense, the thing that we need to do is make sure that our allies like the United States, like Japan, and maybe Australia and Korea, try to get together so that we could balance off China's very, very ambitious thrust towards controlling the West Philippine Sea, where more than $3 trillion worth of business go there every year, where most of the oil coming from the Middle East come through there. And it's therefore important that right away, to be able to get into that situation, the Philippines must start making sure that our economy improves so we can buy ourselves an armed force that can defend ourselves, that can defend our country, in, with the support of other nations.
Okay, but Senator, as we heard that analyst saying in the report we just listened to, while you say that the Philippines will protect its own interests, in that report we heard that analyst say that essentially Duterte set aside a landmark arbitration case that actually ruled against China in the South China Sea, essentially killing the momentum that would have benefited the Philippines. How is that working in the interest of the Philippines then?
Oh, if you're talking about our victory in The Hague with respect to our territory, I don't think we're giving up that claim. It's just that we have to make sure that America will also defend us. We have a mutual defense treaty with the United States, but it will also be subject to its own internal rules, which means it's not automatic. And in our case, we will maintain our claim in the Spratly. Maybe we will not pursue it in the manner that we can pursue it at that time. If we had the armed forces capability, we will continue to talk with China so as to be able to make sure that we get a better purchase on peace and very, very cordial relations with our biggest neighbor.
Okay.
And by the way, our biggest trading partner as well.
Certainly. Abigail, let me turn to you then. Do you think current foreign policy, as dictated by the Philippines government at present, really does work best for the Philippines' long-term interests?
I agree with Senator Gordon when he says there's a transactional element to the Philippines' relationship with China. If by backing off of the South China Sea, hopefully, Chinese aid will flow into the Philippines, but it's unclear if, 10, 20 years down the line, will these territorial claims increase? Will this be in the Philippines' best interests? I think it is potentially on the short-sighted side.
Do you agree with the analyst that said that essentially Duterte has killed the momentum of that ruling against China under international arbitration in the South China Sea?
I think it has certainly hurt the momentum. I think we've seen that in the most recent ASEAN meeting, there has been an agreement to go forward creating a code of conduct for what to do in the South China Sea. But I think the Philippines, who won this victory, backing off is harmful for keeping that momentum going, especially when, for example, a lot of the Philippines' neighbors in the South Pacific are also dealing with the same balance of, do we accept Chinese aid in exchange for not pursuing claims against South China's territorial claims.
Okay, Senator Gordon, let me ask you, how much do you think your government should care right now about the interests of the fishing communities, particularly that we saw in the report we just played there? How much do they matter?
I don't think we're going to compromise anything insofar as national territory is concerned. I draw a red line, for example, on the Spratlys, on the Scarborough Shoals, I'm sorry. But certainly, ASEAN wants to make sure that there is a code of conduct that will be established in ASEAN to prevent unnecessary tensions. And of course, in line with that, we have to make sure that our allies, like the United States, will maintain its support for this code of conduct because it benefits the whole world, not just ASEAN. But since we're closer to China, we have to bear very, very hard on China's intentions, on China's capability, and that is a great deal to do with the part of the answer that we have to give with respect to anything that they would do in this process. Certainly, we're not going to give up our territory.
Okay, then help me better understand how much your government is willing to compromise on its close relationship with the United States, a long-term bond that the Philippines has had with the U.S., in order to favor your relationship with China.
Well, I don't think that we're giving up anything insofar as the United States is concerned. Remember that we have over 4 million Filipinos in the United States. We have had a long history with the United States. We have fought wars together with the United States. And I don't think we're giving them up. And even now, America is aiding us. China is also trying to aid us, trying into our good graces, because it is seeking to make sure that they are able to get their claim established, a historic claim, which has been destroyed by our legal claim in The Hague. And so therefore, we're sticking to that claim. Now, obviously, we would like to maintain close relationships with our biggest trading partner as well. And we don't have to choose between the two of them. We can deal with the situation as they come, and we're not trying to be pragmatic. We have been a loyal ally so far as our fight for democracy and freedom, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we can adequately protect ourselves by making sure that our allies will come to our assistance should we get into trouble. We're not sure of that, and that is why it is better to maintain an independent foreign policy where we try not to assuage China, but to engage China in a dialogue, in a conversation that will show them that our interests are purely to be friendly to all our countries around us, so that we can continue a zone of peace, friendship, and amity in this part of the world.
Okay, Abigail, let me ask you to kind of take a step back and tell us, where do the Philippines most need the alliances that best protect the Philippines' interests?
Well, I think right now one of the big issues is the violent Muslim insurgency in Mindanao and Marawi, and I think really only the United States has the defense and intelligence capabilities to assist the Philippines to the extent that it needs domestic assistance. I think China is coming in almost purely on the economic side, whereas the United States has this defense alliance in addition to providing also development money and diplomatic assistance.
And so how do you think the Philippines should be acting? Do you think right now the balance is correct?
I think that Duterte's statements about his views towards the United States are very troubling. I think the United States will continue to support the Philippines, especially as they try to counter violent extremism. But I also think the United States will have to be careful about making sure that they don't support directly or indirectly Philippine programs that do validate China's claims in the South China Sea. And the United States will have to be careful about making sure that its money is helping, the Philippine domestic issues without giving sovereignty to China implicitly or explicitly in places where China doesn't have sovereignty.
Okay, Senator Gordon, I'll let you respond to that before we go.
Well, we're not going to give up any claim to our sovereignty, and we're not going to allow China to bully us. But we don't have to have that kind of reaction all the time. We have to find out whether China is indeed trying to be friendly to us. We know what their interests are. We know what our interests are, and we're trying to work with them so that there could be mutuality of aims that can be achieved. But if we cannot do that, then we draw the line on our national territory, because
but what about
that is
your
in our
need for
Constitution.
U.S.
We have
support,
to defend our national territory.
The need you have for U.S. support, especially fighting the militant movements in the south of the Philippines?
Well, of course, we need the support of the U.S. military. They have been there supporting us even before what happened in Marawi. They don't have soldiers fighting, but they do have soldiers that are training our Filipinos to fly at night, to get extra electronic intelligence, and even to a certain extent get us some more equipment so that we can find adequately the ISIS-inspired uprising in Marawi. And this is to the interest of America, because they're doing so that ISIS will not grow here, so that it can affect America ultimately in other places, including the United States.
Okay. Richard Gordon, we'll let you have the final word there. I'd like to thank you and Abigail Bard so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers.
If we want to have justice for the victims, if we want to have justice be done, we need a tribunal, we need an office of the prosecutor. So I quit this commission.
War crimes prosecutor Carla Del Ponte has quit the United Nations in disgust over what she calls its failure to act. She says there's enough evidence out there to convict Syria's Bashar al-Assad of war crimes, but yet there's still been no justice for Syrians. Well, some of the most damning evidence came to light 4 years ago with the release of photos known as the Caesar Files, named after the defector who smuggled the images out of the Syrian regime facilities. Rights groups say the signs of starvation and torture are clear evidence of state-sponsored crimes against humanity. Since then, the evidence has only continued to accumulate. But the UN Security Council remains debilitated by Russian and Chinese vetoes, and the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over Syria. Plus, any day now, the U.S. State Department may shut its war crimes office, adding to concerns that abuses could go unpunished. So now legal experts are pursuing what seems like the only feasible option left, filing a case in a European court. Spanish lawyers are trying to prosecute Assad's forces accused of killing a Spanish citizen's brother. One of the people advising the Spanish prosecutors is Ambassador Stephen Rapp. He is the former head of the U.S. War Crimes Office, and he joins me now from New York. Ambassador Rapp, thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin by asking you personally, how important is it to you that something is done to hold the Syrian regime accountable for the war crimes you believe it's committed?
I think it's extremely important. It's certainly the most important thing and the greatest challenge that any of us face in the field of justice. If the crimes that were committed in Syria, as you talked about, what's documented in the Caesar photos, tens of thousands of people tortured to death in government custody. Of course, we've had the attack on hospitals and doctors and humanitarian access, the use of chemical weapons. If all that can be done with impunity, then others will have the same idea when they come to deal with what they view as an insurgency, and none of us will be safe anywhere in the world. I mean, we've spent a great deal of effort globally, beginning at Nuremberg, but particularly in the 90s with Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and then with the International Criminal Court, to really lay the foundation for accountability. The idea, if you do these crimes, you may have to do the time. You may be prosecuted, and if it doesn't happen in Syria, that undermines, frankly, the whole system.
So how important to you is the U.S. War Crimes Office, and what will happen if it is indeed closed?
Well, it is very important, and keep in mind it's not just a Democratic initiative. I was ambassador at large for 6 years in the Obama administration, but it's been open for 20 years. We've had 4 ambassadors, 2 of them in Republican administrations, 2 in Democratic administrations, and strong support in our Congress. I think if the administration moves in this direction, we're actually confident that in Congress and an appropriations bill, they'll work to save the office. Obviously, there are certain things that need to be done in any case, and I'm sure the administration will say, well, this problem can be handled by an assistant secretary for Near East or whatever. But frankly, you need someone that's really focused on this issue and that has experience like all of us have had. I was a prosecutor in Rwanda and in Sierra Leone and tried a chief of state, Charles Taylor, and was convicted and sent to prison for 50 years. And my other colleagues, including the Republicans, had experience in the same way. And this allows us to work very effectively with courts, not just the international courts where we worked, but also with national authorities whose role is so essential in accountability.
But how do you counter the criticism you receive from countries, including Russia and even China, that your work is politically motivated? It's one-sided. The Russians have said, why don't you prosecute George W. Bush or Tony Blair over the millions of innocent deaths that occurred because of the Iraq War that was illegally declared through, in contrast of the United Nations? How do you contrast that, saying it is a political tool to prosecute only people and governments that the United States doesn't like?
Well, and certainly I should note that in my tenure, we worked hard to prosecute people who committed horrible crimes allied with the United States, like the dictator of Guatemala, Rios Montt, who was eventually convicted of genocide, though on appeal it's been set aside, a new trial ordered, or Hissan Habre, who was the dictator of Chad, supported by President Reagan against Gaddafi in the 80s, but who tortured to death tens of thousands of his people we supported the trial of him that recently convicted him in Senegal and sentenced him to life. I mean, no country is perfect in this regard, but the United States has exercised leadership in this area, and we believe in holding our own people to account. When Blackwater guards, attacked those civilians in Nisour Square, they were tried, those guards, even though they'd had great service records, and convicted and sentenced to long terms. They're still appealing that in terms of their sentence, and the government under President Trump is continuing to press for tough punishment. So we do believe in holding people to account. We prefer it at the national level, and when you talk about crimes, not necessarily crimes in terms of how a conflict began, but how it's fought, and whether civilians are intentionally targeted, whether you go in and want to kill all the Sunni or all the Yazidi or all the Shia, et cetera, in a particular area, or all the Tutsi, and target the civilians, not military targets, and sometimes civilians being killed by mistake. When you do that kind of thing, the U.S. is absolutely solid as a rock that we need to have accountability.
Okay. Now, as for the case that's been built against Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime, how strong is your case? How much evidence do you genuinely have? And is it even worse? I heard Carla Del Ponte herself argue that the evidence is even stronger than what was given against Rwanda, the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide, as well as former Yugoslavia.
Well, I certainly agree with Carla. I worked with Carla. She appointed me as a prosecutor at the Rwanda tribunal, and she's correct in that regard. And part of it is the mania of the Syrian regime. They may have learned this from the Russians, I don't know whom, but they did an enormous amount of paperwork that actually does document the plan by Assad and his regime to suppress what was peaceful protest in the street. Not with a light touch, not with prosecuting people for real crimes, but by disappearing them into the detention facilities, killing tens of thousands, releasing some maimed and brutalized as a message to others: don't you dare raise your head, or you too will be destroyed. And this was done at the very highest level. We've got groups, of course, there's what Carla has done, which she was on this UN-created commission created by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which operates by majority vote and can't be blocked by veto. And it's done great reports every 6 months about the various crimes. But others have gone in there more deeply, supported by various governments, including this group called CIJA, which is supported by government groups, has 130 Syrians working with it, and they've brought out 750,000 pages of regime documents and analyzed all of it. They have 1 million names in their database of Syrian victims and perpetrators. And so it is immense evidence. It's even better than we had against the Nazis, to be frank. Okay. So it's there. Now, of course, yeah, there's something else that's happening that I did want to mention, but go ahead, please.
No, go ahead then. Do finish.
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, Carla is not the only UN game in town. I mean, this Commission of Inquiry from Geneva, because of the blockage of the Security Council in New York, the General Assembly, under the leadership of European and countries in the region, moved a resolution to create a mechanism that's like an office of the prosecutor. It passed the UN by a vote of 105 to 15, and it's being stood up in Geneva, and it will build cases. Now, it has no court to take those to at the international level, but it'll work very closely with European courts. And right. You mentioned the Spanish case, but there are also cases in Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, and work with those countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to get out and interview witnesses in refugee camps and all of that, but they can help provide that evidence that fits a national system, and we can see some cases proceeding that way. So something else is being done beyond the Commission of Inquiry, which will certainly continue even with Carla no longer on it.
I mean, as you've said, the evidence is there, but the legal infrastructure isn't. You're trying this case in Spain now, but it has been delayed. In fact, it may be eliminated if this next appeal doesn't work. If that is the case, what other legal channels are there? What can you do?
Well, there are other, in Germany at the moment, Germany has universal jurisdiction. It can try any case from anywhere in the world, whether it has the perpetrators or victims as among its citizens or among its residents. It, of course, has tens of thousands of Syrians that have come there and have been provided with refuge. And it has an immense number of them that survived the torture chambers and whose families died there. And they have to make a determination that it's in their public interest, proceed with these kind of cases. And they're in an active investigative phase. They've been interviewing witnesses. They've got the evidence from the Caesar files. They have other evidence from CIJA, the ones that I described, the 750,000 pages, and they're analyzing it. It's believed by the end of the year that they will begin a formal prosecution, which could include senior regime figures in Syria. Now, of course, will those people come to trial in Stuttgart or somewhere? Not right away, but international arrest warrants can go out by Interpol, and if those folks are traveling somewhere in Asia and they think they're safe, bam, they can get arrested at a border and shift off to Germany. And it's sort of a signal to them that for as long as they live, they're going to face the prospect of justice. And we've seen in other cases where people think they're going to get away with it, like somebody like Habre, 27 years after he's overthrown, is convicted and sentenced for life in an African country 2,000 miles away from his home. So this does indicate that there will be some justice in Syria. But the best place for justice in Syria, of course, is in Syria, and that has to be an essential part of any peace agreement.
Indeed. Okay, Stephen Rapp, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Okay, well, enjoyed speaking with you this morning. Take care.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Next time, we'll ask if an intense Saudi military operation to root out Shia fighters from the country is justified. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.